It's 2025 and a new year means brand new opportunities. And for a lot of you out there, I know you've been thinking about one thing over the holidays, and that is starting your own business. But you have so many questions like, how do I get started? How do I come up with a brand? How do I even sell stuff to people? And what am I even going to sell? Now take a deep breath. Shopify has got you. Shopify makes it simple to create your brand, open for business, and get your first sale. And you can get your store up and running easily with thousands of customizable templates. You don't have to be a coding nerd or a design geek to get this done. All you need to do is drag and drop. Shopify also helps with the details like shipping, taxes, and payments from one single dashboard, so you can focus on the important stuff, like growing your business. Established in 2025 has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/truecrime, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/truecrime to start selling with Shopify today. Shopify.com/truecrime.
I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, by my continuing co-host, Brett.
Nice, Alice. Good with the puns, as always. Love it.
Well, this is just like legal nerd-ish because, guys, Brett's great. We like him, whatever. Don't make his head get too big. What we're actually excited about is being joined by the Murder Sheet today, who are coming to us from a full day in court where we thought we would be in a suppression hearing for Richard Allen and, of course, the Delphi double murder case. But that suppression hearing has been continued, hence my pun. And because this was not broadcasted, there's no live tweeting because phones weren't allowed in the courtroom. You are getting from the horse's mouth people who were sitting in the courtroom, and without the Murder Sheet, there'd be so much information we don't know about this case. So thank you guys for joining us after an exhausting day.
We're so lucky to have you guys, and y'all should know, as busy as they were, they reached out to ask if we want to do this, and I'm just blown away by their generosity. I'm sure everybody knows who you guys are, but if you want to introduce yourselves briefly before we get into the rest of this.
Thank you guys so much for having us on. We love your show and just love everything you guys do, so we're super, always excited to talk to you. I'm Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney. And we really wanted to reach out to you guys because we wanted to give you the heads up that everybody thought this was going to be a suppression story, a suppression hearing, and that would be the big headline. And we wanted to let you know last night that that wasn't going to be the case.
Also, too, our podcast is called The Murder Sheet, and we basically talk about legal stuff, different homicides. We kind of cover a bunch of different cases, but we've been on the Delphi case for a while now, and that's been one that's been interesting lately because we're actually going towards a trial and possibly some sort of resolution in that case at this point.
Absolutely. You guys have to check out the Murder Sheet if you haven't already heard of it. They have not only been covering Delphi closely, they are getting involved in speaking with a lot of people who are involved in the investigation in the case and also making filings.
Yes.
Yeah, they're parties now.
They are parties. Do you want to talk really quick about the filing you guys made?
Basically, what's been going on is Judge Gold, the judge in this case, can be very intimidating to people. And we believe that after she issued her gag order in the case, some court employees didn't want to run afoul of her. And so basically, anytime anything gets filed in this case, it is routinely sealed, even if the prosecutor or defense doesn't file any request to be sealed. And in fact, in the cases where the prosecutor or defense does file a request for another document to be sealed, the request for it to be sealed is itself sealed, which is very bizarre. And so we filed a motion basically saying, hey, this is contrary to how procedure works in Indiana. A lot of this needs to be made public. We filed that about a week or 10 days ago. And actually the hearing today began with Judge Gull saying she'd been looking things over and she's going to be unsealing a whole bunch of documents, and they will be made available on a website next week for the public. So we should have a lot of interesting reading next week.
Yeah, this has been one of the most secretive cases. I mean, from the very beginning. And you kind of thought once it moved on to a trial situation, as we always say, once it goes to trial, secrets are over. Now it's time for the public to see what you got. And that hasn't been happening. And I understand that we deal with this a lot. There are things that have to be filed under seal. You know, there are some competency issues. There's some mental health issues in this case. A lot of that stuff involves health records that will be filed under seal. Totally understand that. A motion to suppress should not be filed under seal. That one really kind of surprised me. That's the one that should be available for everybody. So I'm glad you guys did that, and I'm glad we're going to get to see some of that. But let's talk about what happened today. You guys know, y'all were there. So educate us, and we're just going to let y'all talk, because I'm just really excited to hear the nuts and bolts of what you saw.
Totally. This was a big day. We kind of knew going into it that this could be a big day, and we kind of got a little over our skis in our episode last night, where we kind of were like, it's gonna be interesting.
It was officially going to be a hearing on a motion to suppress, and also a due process hearing. And as the session began, after the judge made her announcement about the documents being unsealed next week, she also announced we're not going to do the motion to suppress at all. We're just going to concentrate on the due process hearing. And the due process hearing in this involves the request that the defense made a few months ago for Richard Allen to be moved to a different prison. And so we can go into the legal arguments about that. Actually, they wanted him to be moved from a prison to a jail. And we can discuss the legal arguments for that. But pretty early on in the proceedings, the prosecutor, Nick McClelland, said, one reason why it's important for him to be in a prison is there's more security. And we need more security because other inmates are apt to want to commit violence against someone once they hear he's been charged with doing harm to children, and once they hear he's actually confessed to that crime multiple times.
What happened in the courtroom when that was said?
Okay, so I feel like we were reading too much into it, because we were like, wow, okay, that is the headline right there. I mean, that is a very big development. And I felt like I didn't know if everybody was like getting that. And also, one problem is that this microphone system in this courtroom was, you could not hear a lot that people were saying if you were not in the front row. And frankly, we were in the front row of like the public, and it was still hard to hear. And so I think a lot of people missed that, or they were like, wait, did he confess to the crime? And so there was a lot of like confusion, I think, in the recess immediately following this. And we were kind of trying to be like, this is very interesting. And I think some people were just kind of like a little bit shell shocked. And I can't blame them, because this case is always something,
Yeah. And to me, once I heard about that, and if it wasn't as big a deal, please disabuse us all of that notion. It's hard for that not to be a big deal. Like, I saw Bob Mata, who's a friend of the show and a great guy, does Defense Diaries, if people don't listen to that show, saying that it was kind of a dud. And my thought was, I don't know how saying somebody confessed 4 or 5 times could possibly be a dud. That seems like a bombshell no matter what.
So it sounds like there were a lot of people in the courtroom. Can you set it up for us? I mean, obviously, when you make that assertion, you guys probably have eyes on the defense, the prosecution, the judge, because you know where to be looking. Forget the gallery. The gallery may not be educated and know what's going on. Was there like a scuffle? You just, not scuffle, but everyone shuffling, for papers. Was there a recess because of that particular argument? What kind of walk us through what happened when that, really, I would say that's a bombshell, was dropped?
We definitely agree. And I would say it's kind of interesting because so Allen has 2 very talented defense attorneys, and they're well known in Indiana and in their areas. They're very well respected. And so Brad Rosie, one of them, was doing most of the talking today for the defense. He actually is the one who put it out there initially. And I think that was strategic, because I think he knew this is going to come out in this hearing now. Let me introduce it and point out there are issues with it. So Leland ran with that. He was like a dog with a bone this entire hearing.
And there's a couple of different possibilities there, because the first thing that comes to your mind is this man is in solitary confinement. Who the heck is he confined to?
Hey guys, I don't want you a single word to be missed. Is everyone else hearing Kevin breaking up just a little bit?
Oh.
If so, I'm going to mute my video, because that sometimes helps. You guys don't go off video. Okay. I'm going to go off video because that might save bandwidth.
Yeah. Basically, y'all were saying when it started getting kind of shaky. You were saying that the defense attorney brought it in first. That was a strategic move, and everybody who's ever practiced law knows you want to front bad information. And then you were talking about how once he did that, from that point forward, they were like a dog with a bone on that issue, which I can understand why that would be.
So, yeah, Nick McClelland was constantly bringing it up over and over again. And I want to mention some context because I think the first question that comes to a lot of people's minds is who exactly was Richard Allen confessing to, since he's basically in solitary confinement. And there's a couple of different possibilities here. The prosecution talked about how he has access to a tablet. It's a tablet where he can, buy music, listen to music, and he can also make phone calls to his family. And there were some suggestions in some of the phone calls to his family. He discussed the case and that certain of those calls, recordings were made available to the defense, which suggests that those calls might have been pretty important. So perhaps at least some of the confessions could be to family members. And the other thing that might be relevant is there is kind of an unusual system. Maybe it's not unusual. There's a system in this prison where if a person is on suicide watch, there's something called companions. You want to talk about that?
Yes, suicide companions. They're basically other inmates who are entrusted with watching over people on suicide watch in the maximum control unit. And at some point, Richard Allen was partnered up with one of these people. And that's kind of bizarre and disturbing. But that's another, the defense raised that as an issue a number of times. So we were wondering maybe someone in that position heard something, in which case you kind of get into some jailhouse snitch territory. And we all know that can be somewhat problematic, but interesting.
That's so fascinating that you're getting kind of where the source is of these comments, because like you said, jailhouse snitch, there's usually some sort of motive because people are like, oh, I can get something out of this / they may be bored and just talking, and they are representing that they're hearing something when in fact maybe they heard it second, third, fourth hand. But when you say it's a jailhouse call, we've told this to so many people, and I know you guys know this, your calls from prison are always recorded. Even when you're talking to your attorney. Now, you're not allowed to listen to the attorney calls when it's attorney-client privilege, but it doesn't mean that record isn't always happening because you have no privacy. And if that is the case, then, of course, the prosecution would have to turn over those tapes, and someone usually it's an agent, listening to those jailhouse call tapes all the time. And we find they happen right before a hearing because there's a lot of calls and you don't have all the time in the world to listen to them. So they typically do come up right around a hearing. And I wonder if this is what happened. They were probably reviewing all of his calls and they were like, bombshell. But the great thing about this is it isn't hearsay. It is his own words, meaning it is from a party opponent and absolutely admissible.
Yeah, there's a couple interesting things in what you just said. Number one, there's not going to be a trial in January. I think I can say that for certain. That's going to be an interesting suppression issue in of itself. These buddies, are they agents of the state? Are they agents? They're sort of put in there. We often say, I can't just walk into your room and search it without a warrant. I also can't tell the maid, hey, go search that room and let me know if you found anything, because then you become an agent of the police, even though they're not a police officer. So these buddies are going to be fascinating too. I feel like there will be some interesting suppression issues. I don't think any suppression issues they've raised up to this point, unless there's something in those filings that's really surprising, are going to be pretty standard stuff. The warrant wasn't fulsome enough. There was that kind of stuff. And that always fails. But those issues might be pretty interesting once we get into that. And hearing about these statements makes, to me, and I hate to be a cynic, but the filing from a few months ago by the defense, the sort of prisoner of war filing, right, where he says he's suicidal and he's mentally incompetent, basically, and he's being treated terribly, he's being tortured, and he's basically a prisoner of war. When they filed that, I thought, I know you're trying to get sympathy, and everybody, whenever a defense attorney files anything, everybody believes it, and you just see that. And you saw that in here. Like, people are like, oh man, they shouldn't be treating him that badly. But I wondered what the real purpose was. Now that I've heard about these statements, it seems like all of that is part of one big effort to keep these statements out. to say, look, when he made those statements, he was incompetent, he had mental issues, he was being taken advantage of, so they should all go out for you pick which reason they can't come in. Is that sort of the sense that you guys got as well?
We'd hate to like be cynical and ascribe any insincere motivations to any party in this case, obviously. But I mean, it does seem like it would benefit that narrative of maybe raising into question any statements made while he's incarcerated, if he's losing his mind while he's incarcerated. So that does dovetail.
And if you want to be cynical, we can talk a little bit about one of the pictures in that filing. There were 2 pictures in that filing, one of which was taken of Richard Allen while he was incarcerated. I'm sure most of us have seen it. It shows him wearing a very dirty shirt and looking a bit bedraggled. The prosecutor brought that up when he had the warden of Westfield on the stand. And the prosecutor actually took a moment to read a couple of the phrases from the motion saying, he said he's in a dog kennel and he's being treated like a prisoner of war. And you could hear the contempt in the prosecutor's voice and the sarcasm. And then he said, let's talk about this picture. And the warden claimed that the fact that the shirt he was wearing was so dirty and in such awful condition was because Richard Allen had just come from his recreation period. And Richard Allen has a shirt he always wears to every one of his recreation periods because he doesn't want to get his other shirts dirty. And in fact, he had other shirts available in his cell, according to the warden, that he could have changed into before visiting his attorney if he wished. And he also mentioned that Richard Allen does have a commissary account, which he's used to buy new clothes. So he said, this is not the way Richard Allen typically is dressed in prison. This is not the way anybody is typically dressed in the prison here. This is just a shirt he chose to wear while he was doing his recreation period.
And you guys are very, very kind of making sure you don't ascribe any sort of motive. I don't think you're ascribing anything. I think it's a fantastic tactic because if you have a client who's not listening to you, and you know what, it's really hard to get your client to listen to you sometimes, especially when a lot is on the line. So you bet your bottom dollar he has been told to be quiet from his attorney all the time, probably in court today, probably every time his attorney visits him. And every attorney will tell you that at some point your client is not going to listen to you. And when they repeatedly do something that is hurting their case, you have to deal with the cards that you are dealt with. And so I don't think it's necessarily sneaky or whatnot. I mean, you could probably get a doctor to say, if you're doing something that is actively hurting yourself, there may be something wrong mentally, right? And so I would say this is absolutely a tactic that is used, and not necessarily, unless it's proven otherwise, it's not a bad tactic. I'm not sure that I wouldn't try to do something like that because these comments, these admissions are incredibly damning, and you have to do something with them. You can't just say, don't believe him. You have to give a reason not to believe him. So I think everything you guys have explained makes a lot of sense. And I'm just letting you know that you're being very nice, that I think this is a good tactic.
Be very generous. That's a journalistic integrity that I love. And I'll just say, anybody who's ever worked as a prosecutor has had that moment where the defense attorney is like, well, we think we got a good case. And you're like, well, today we just pulled some jail calls and your guy completely admits everything he did. And they're like, oh. Right. And that it happens.
And it happens like
all the time.
All
the time. And I've got to think, this case is very circumstantial in the way people often mean circumstantial. Like there's some weak circumstantial evidence. It's good, but it's weak. And then the bullet, and that's good. But they're going to, we're going to fight over the scienciness of that and whether it should come in at all and all their stuff. And the defense is probably thinking we got a good chance. And then they're like, oh, he's confessing to everybody that he did it. And at that point, they had to come up with some sort of strategy to keep these out, whether it's going to be these were somehow custodial because it was to these people who were buddies, but they're really agents of the state, so therefore they shouldn't come in, or whether he was mentally incompetent at the time, or whether they were under duress because he's being tortured. They had to come up with something. And that filing just feels so calculated now. And it was a great tactic. Like Alice said, I'm not being critical of them. It's a great move, great play,
You have to do something.
A lot. Yeah, you got to do something. So that feels like what they're doing.
And that's really interesting because I see some people asking this question, but there is a difference. I know you guys know this, between insanity and competence. And just, by the way, It's shocking how many people actually admit to crimes when they're in custody. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's like you're so close to it and people just, they know they're being recorded, but they don't know. So when I listen to jail calls and I'm like, why are you saying this out loud? I can listen to this, and I do. And they still say it. But the difference is, so he could be potentially incompetent. Now, that's not an insanity defense, though. Competency is just how he is this second right now. That's why he's wearing the dirty shirt and he's lost all this weight and he looks gaunt. Competency has nothing to do with whether he was insane at the time of the offense, because insanity as a defense, you still have to go to trial and say, at the time that I killed them, I was not with my wits. And so I didn't commit a crime because I didn't know what I was doing. Whereas competency is right now, I can't be tried for what I've been charged with because I don't have an ability to help my lawyer with my defense. And you can see how that's a valid argument. He's clearly not helping his defense by confessing a lot of times.
And I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but there's one thing that came up and I didn't really understand what they were talking about. So I'm hoping there was a little bit more clarity in the room. This thing about some of his conversations with his lawyers were recorded, and is that a problem? Somebody brought that up. What exactly was that about?
Oh man, that was a saga, because that kind of unfolded over a number of witness conversations and cross-examination. So you had the prosecution portraying it one way and then the defense saying something else. The most eye-catching, I guess, image from that was at one point, Brad Rosie, the defense attorney, mentioned, with a witness, actually his own intern was a witness on the stand at this point, that basically the defense team had been followed around the prison with a camcorder, like a prison guard holding a camcorder on them as they walked with Richard Allen to where they were going to meet with him. And then basically sat in a room with a big window and somebody has the camcorder filming them through that window. So it's a very surreal, odd image that the defense was basically kind of putting out there. So basically, prosecution witnesses kind of came in and tried to clarify that as like, we weren't recording for sound. The area where they wanted to meet with him does not have a camera. And basically, in other instances, there would be a camera in the room in case something happened, in case he hurt his attorneys, essentially. And so,
Right.
That's kind of an example where you have a dramatic opening and then, an explanation. And, you can kind of understand there's two sides to it. But yeah, there were other instances. Basically one thing Prosecutor McClelland kept on hammering home was like, he's going to be filmed just about anywhere. There's going to be cameras on him in his cell. It's not going to be sound recording. It's just going to be the video. But the surveillance is going to be constant no matter where he goes. So like, if you want him to go to a jail, it's going to be the same deal. I'm sorry. I feel like I'm rambling and I don't know if I answered your question.
You absolutely did. And that's exactly what I knew the answer would be. But I'm always impressed by defense attorneys and their ability to use very common standard things and make it sound shocking. And that's basically what they did. Everybody's like, oh, I can't believe it. They were filming him. So yeah, they're in the prison with him. There's all sorts of reasons you want to film him. Like you said, if he hurts them, you want to have that on film. If the attorneys are passing him contraband, which I'm not saying these guys would do that, but guess what? Happens all the time in prisons. You'd want to have that too. So yeah, like having surveillance on you in a prison, it's not ideal if you're the defense attorney, but it also is not the kind of thing, particularly the sound, that's going to go over to the prosecution team. The prosecution team's not going to be sitting in their office watching the video from the prison surveillance system. If they did, that's the kind of thing that could get them disbarred.
That's a great point, because like we were saying, jailhouse calls are always recorded, and it's your agent that listens to those calls. So if there were any sound, which it sounds like there wasn't, it would be like an agent who's in between that, and they don't pass it on to the attorney. So the attorneys aren't like, oh, now we have this, we can't use it, it's not admissible, but we've listened to it. No, not at all. And anyone who's an attorney knows to cross that line, you're putting your entire bar license on the line. And, of course I would make this argument as well if I was the defense, but it sounds like it's a nothing burger.
That was our take. And yeah, there was just a lot of debate about like what's proper, what's a proper space for the defense attorneys when they're in prison and, kind of feeling crowded, feeling like they're not able to meet with him in an easy fashion. And we certainly saw like their point with that. And certainly their point that, one thing that pretty much, they had numerous witnesses, two specifically, the warden and then a captain at Westville, which is the prison where Richard Allen is. And they basically noted that it is really unusual for a pre-trial detainee to be at that prison, especially like in maximum security. And so I think that point was well taken. But then other points seem to be kind of more of like, I mean, at one point the judge even kind of asked the defense attorney, like, a lot of these seem to be more of like a inconvenient for you as opposed to your client. And that was kind of like a brutal, like, oh my God, you know, like
he said that.
Oh, the judge, yeah. Basically, I'm paraphrasing, but it was like, I mean, like, we were both like wincing, like, oh God, and like, you know, that was an intense moment when. And he was like, no, what's good for me is good for my client. So I mean, he recovered, I think, fairly well from that, but that was intense.
Basically, everything that happened in the hearing today was all about this, whether or not he should be moved thing, right?
Yeah.
Whether he should be moved to the local jail. And the discussion of the confessions came in just as it will be even more dangerous for him in a jail where they now don't necessarily have the same kind of solitary confinement capabilities, because he is more likely to come into contact with someone who decides to kill him because he's confessed to killing 2 girls in brutal fashion in a famous case. I mean, that's essentially why they brought the confessions up. And is that also why the judge limited discussion of the contents and the situation of the confessions? Because it really, as much as we would all like to know that, it wasn't actually that relevant to that specific point.
I think so. I know at one point when McClellan was bringing up the confessions, I believe Rosie objected and Judge Gull actually overruled it because she noted that evidentiary standards would be different, essentially. It's sort of hard to hear them at certain points, so I apologize if I'm butchering that. But, you know, they didn't get into the details. We don't know what was said. We do know from the defense perspective, they said these statements were incoherent. It's not as great as it sounds. Like, we don't think, you know, it's a real zinger of a 5 or 6 confessions. But, you know, at the same time, I mean, I think we left wondering, like, okay, well, what exactly? I mean, we can understand. We've heard about false confessions, right? We've all heard about that in the context of an interview with law enforcement gone wrong, or in the context of somebody bragging and, like, you know, trying to seem like they're really cool and for some reason murdering people is cool. You know, it basically, like, there is a situation where we can all see where a false confession happens, but without really knowing more context, it's frustrating because you can kind of imagine things, but we're trying to, like, temper our imaginations right now.
Honestly, what that sounds like, because there wasn't discussion of the substance, like you said, it sounded like because it was a well-attended and a very high publicity event that the attorney was trying to make an argument to the public rather than to the court, right? Because you would need to obviously have if I were them, I'd move to suppress these statements. But what he's doing is, like, clearly everyone just heard that there are these statements and there's going to be articles about it. This is going to be the headline, you know, because if you've ever been to a court hearing, nothing is actually fireworks. The news always makes it seem like there's fireworks, but when you sit in a court hearing, everything is actually pretty even keeled, as it should be, because the judge isn't supposed to show any emotion. The attorneys are not really supposed to show any emotion. And so unless you know what you're hearing, it's supposed to feel very boring in a good way, because emotion shouldn't have any place in a courtroom. But I think those attorneys are smart. They know exactly what journalists are going to run out with, because that is the headliner. And he's trying to give his side of the story and kind of appeal to the public and basically say, like, nope, stick with us. The case is not over. But I don't think that was a real legal argument. And a jury, because he knows everyone's listening.
Potential jury out there. Yeah. I mean, you walk into that place and you're like, can I be unbiased? He confessed to it. How can I be unbiased? That's probably going to be an issue as well. So I can see why they would try and limit it. Well, I'll ask you this question. We've talked about whether he's faking it or not. You guys were in the courtroom with him. What did you think? Did he look?
Tell us what he looked like
look?
First.
Yeah.
One thing I'll mention is, of course, we've been at the other hearings with him. And when he walks into the court, typically his wife and his mother are there. They were there today. And typically when he walks by them, there's usually some sort of little moment with them where he acknowledges them. Sometimes he'll, like, mouth the words, "I love you." Today, when he walked into the court, he had kind of a dazed expression on his face. And when he walked past his family, didn't seem to be any sign of recognition or anything at all.
Yeah, I would say, you know, I know that the prison officials who were witnesses kind of noted that, like, listen, his BMI is not unhealthy, you know, like, he's not starving. he has dropped a substantial amount of weight, and it's actually pretty jarring to see his initial mugshot and how he looks today. His face is sunken, his head is all like shaved down, and as Kevin said, it's kind of a dazed, frightened look. I feel like, I mean, you're reading into it, and I don't believe in like the body language stuff most of the time, but I think like he like looks. I mean, he looked freaked out in the beginning, but he looked like a person who's like, oh my gosh, what is happening? Now he just looks like, I mean, like it's like a terrified look almost, and not somebody who you feel is like super lucid. And then and people say, oh, well, that means he's an innocent man, or, oh, that means he's guilty. And I just think it's like I think whatever's happening, there might be a level of sincerity there, but it doesn't mean he's guilty. It doesn't mean he's innocent. It's just like a person in some level of distress, which could be the case with a guilty or an innocent man, frankly.
When you said that he looked terrified, does that mean like he was aware of what was happening and looked like scared about what was happening, or just generally dazed and checked out?
I would say, I mean, there was something like with his eyes where it's like kind of like a wide-eyed, like very shifty, like looking around rapidly, assessing the whole scene, but not really seeing it, like is how I would characterize it. I think on our show, I somewhat inelegantly described it like almost like a frightened animal. Like, I'm not saying that to be degrading, but just like raw terror, like not like, okay, how do I figure this out, but just reactive, if that makes sense.
And I'm not suggesting this, but I think it's helpful to know kind of all the different arguments there are. Walking in today, he likely, and he should have met with his attorney, and they know what filings they've made. The filings about, with the picture and with the conditions that he's in, and that his attorneys will have told him, we are trying to get you moved out of here. And there are obviously lots of ways you can present yourself. And one of the things when you're talking about someone's competency or health and mental health, the first thing, or one of the main things that any expert or medical doctor is looking for in their assessee is something called malingering. And malingering is just where you lean into looking worse than you actually are, or taking on some sort of demeanor that is not how you normally are. Malingering basically is faking it, right? And I'm not saying that's what it is here, but I think it's very important because that will be the main question, is whether he is faking it. That's why the guard said he had other clothes that he could have worn, basically saying like there are choices here, and there are choices that he's making to look a certain way at a certain time. Not bad, because it's a real shirt that he's wearing. He really did lose weight, which, by the way, a lot of people do, because when you cut out alcohol and sugar and junk food and are on a diet that keeps you alive, absolutely, and healthy in terms of BMI. But like, I know how I eat, and like, I would absolutely drop weight if someone just closed my pantry for me. So I'm not suggesting he's malingering, but I do think that's very important here, because that will be the main question if they are going to be arguing about his competency, is whether he's faking it to some degree.
Yeah, that's a great point. And actually, thinking about it, there's something I'd like to ask you guys to speculate about, because it was certainly something I wondered about, and I think Anya did as well. At one point, the warden of Westville Correctional Facility was on the stand. And by the way, he was a terrific witness. We can talk about that later if you want. But he was being questioned by the prosecutor, Nick McClelland. And it came out as a result of the questioning that during the time Richard Allen has been incarcerated there, he has written the warden 5 or 6 letters. And right after that question was answered, the defense attorneys called for a sidebar. There was a conference at the bench, and when questioning resumed, it was onto another subject altogether. So I was wondering if either of you had any speculation about what might have been in those letters.
I mean, that's a great question, right? I mean, look, I think if you're the judge in that situation, in this situation, this is a very weird hearing, because it's a hearing that's basically about, do we move this guy from a prison to a jail? But a lot of stuff's coming out that has some real negative connotations for him. And as we talked about the jury and everything else, and I just wonder if maybe at some point there was a, look, we've talked about this enough thing there. Like, is this really relevant to what we're talking about? Or is this just sort of piling on whatever he wrote in those letters? I think there's a couple things about the letters that could be, once again, the warden's a warden, right? Like, if he's voluntarily writing letters to the warden admitting what he did, that's going to be a problem for him later on. But I could imagine them saying, hey, before this all comes out, we'd at least like an opportunity to challenge whether these letters can be admissible at all or something along those lines. I mean, it seems like, now I'll say this, it's not weird at all for him to do that because inmates they really like somebody, right? Like a defendant, the judge, they love the judge. I mean, the judge can end up giving them, 50 years in prison, but for some reason, they love the judge. They always feel like the judge treated them fairly, right? Sometimes they really like the prosecutors, which may seem weird. I mean, the people they really don't like are the people who testify against them. That tends to be where a lot of the animosity is. So police officers, a lot of times they develop a relationship with police officers. That's why you can have some of these big Miranda questions where, were you coercing this person? Were they speaking freely? Were you doing sort of some real subtle coercion by making them feel like they were your friend when they had said they didn't want to talk anymore? All that stuff happens. So I could imagine him seeing the warden as his friend, like the warden is his ultimate sort of the person who can help him. And that he may have written things in those letters because of that and thought, this is between us. I mean, the number of times defendants will say things like that to a police officer, well, just between us, and it's like, it's never just between you.
And it's interesting, like, lest you guys think that Brett's exaggerating, some of our agents who transport defendants regularly, I've seen them walk through the prisons and they are literally like fist bumping and high-fiving the defendants who they arrested and have arrested a lot and testify against them in court because your friends are just who you like, right? I mean, we're probably thinking about the same person, Brett, but this like one guy, I mean, he is like the defendant whisperer. People tell him everything. And he literally is their like best friend. And he arrests them. He is the one who arrests them and transports them. And because he's the case agent, he testifies against them like all the time. And they're like, man, you got to do what you got to do. And they still love him and they talk to him. And we like call him and like, hey, what'd you hear from him? And he tells us because he's law enforcement. So this is not at all uncommon. And remember, who is Richard Allen seeing on a daily basis? The warden, right? I mean, he doesn't get to see his family. He doesn't get to see the outside world. He's not watching, he has a tablet listening to music, but he has a lot of time on his hands. And when you see someone every single day, they are your connection to community. And
prison is not like people think it is. It's not like it is in the movies where the guards, I'm sure it is some places, but generally speaking, the guards, they're not, they don't walk around with guns. They don't have guns. There's one of them to every 50 or 100 inmates. They have a real incentive to have a really good relationship with the inmates. Same thing with the wardens. And the situation in a prison is very difficult for someone who's never been in prison or been to a prison to understand, because you wouldn't think of it that way. But just imagine you're plucked out of freedom. You're thrown in this prison. As Alice said, you don't ever get to talk to you get to see your family once a week, maybe call them a little bit. But for the most part, you're in this prison. There are a lot of scary people in the prison. Who's your protector? Well, it turns out it's the guards and the warden. So you can form a pretty close relationship, and you'll hear that a lot from prisoners. They'll talk about their relationships with guards. A lot of times at parole hearings, you'll have guards and wardens write letters for prisoners. So it is a different dynamic that's really hard to imagine. So it does not surprise me that he wrote those letters. I'd love to see what's in them. I'm sure they will be the subject of inevitable multiple hearings in this case, which is why I think it's laughable that we're going to have a trial in 6 months. That's just, there are, just to go through some of the things that are going to happen before that. Number one, and I would be interested how much of this was telegraphed by the defense attorneys. Competency hearing. Like, they are steaming towards a competency hearing. Everything they do is pointing to him not being competent. And you can't have a competency hearing without a competency evaluation. Was that discussed? Because that is going to delay this thing for at least 6 months, probably more like a year.
Right. All the substance freezes then.
Yeah, that makes sense. That wasn't even brought up at all. It kind of was weird almost. Like, it almost felt tacked on at the end where they're like trial dates, it was kind of like, okay, that's ambitious. But basically they were just throwing out January then. And then they kind of kicked us all out for the ex parte hearing. But it was a bit abrupt because, as you said, feels like we're going towards competency. Frankly, maybe this is me reading too much into it. I didn't feel like the defense sounded that enthusiastic to talk about trial dates. I mean, I didn't, they were kind of like, I don't,
So every case has to be set for trial. That's just like, it's an administrative thing. You cannot have a case that is pending with no trial date. And so oftentimes you'll get trial dates set that everyone knows it's not going to be that date, but like, it's quite, I think like you can't even close out that case file if there's no trial date. And so part of it might just be, it has sounded abrupt because it was almost administrative to everyone involved because of what was going to happen in the ex parte hearing.
Joe raises a good question, and I should know the answer to this, but I don't. Have we had either an indictment or a preliminary hearing in this case? Like, is this formally moved to a point where we can even have a trial? Has that happened yet?
No.
Okay.
So there's a lot to go on then.
That's another problem for the. Has he officially pled not guilty yet?
I believe he has.
Yeah.
So he did
So
that.
there has to be a charging document then.
Well, I mean, he was arrested on a complaint.
Yeah.
And if they just waived preliminary hearing at this point, do we
They
know?
might have. There's so many documents in this case that have been sealed.
Oh, that's right. So much has been sealed. So they might have just waived that altogether.
Yeah. It's a bit, yeah. And that's why we're hoping, with the kind of, a lot of people tend to think that we're just kind of like, cowboys kicking down the door, like, but you put all the information out there. We obviously certain things have to remain sealed to protect his rights and to protect the prosecution's case, frankly. And we understand that. But I feel like there's been also so many, this case attracts so much dumb speculation and everybody's corrupt and Carroll County's corrupt. And I really feel if people are seeing the process work as it should, then I think that, at the very least kind of pushes back against some of that.
So let me go to the second thing that's going to happen. A suppression hearing is apparently something the defense wants to do. Was there any talk of scheduling when that's actually going to happen?
They haven't scheduled anything. I will say that one of the lawyers in this case, within the last year, he was on a legal team in another case where there was a multiple homicide. And a crucial piece of evidence was a gun seized from the home of the accused party. And they were able to get that search warrant and that gun thrown out. But it was only a temporary victory because the Court of Appeals overturned it. So I think if you look at that case, the man named Caden Smith, you'd get a sense of some of the arguments we'd probably be likely to see in that.
Didn't he voluntarily turn over his gun, or did they?
Again, that's all been sealed.
Yeah,
that's all been sealed. Okay. Yes. Okay. So we'll have to have that. Then there's the other thing. I mean, people have talked about the ballistics in terms of suppression, but it's not really a suppression issue. It's a Daubert issue. And whether or not there's a scientific basis for ballistics on an unspent ejected round, there will have to be a hearing there. And you're going to have ballistics experts on both sides, I would think, give their opinion on whether or not that meets the Daubert standard and whether or not it can come in at trial. That is another hearing that's going to have to happen sometime in the next 6 months.
And that's an interesting subject because when we talk to people who work with defense attorneys, they tell us this ballistics evidence is absolute garbage. It's completely worthless. And then you talk to people on the prosecution side, and they say this ballistics evidence is incredible. There was recently,
I don't know, those defense attorneys are crazy. Like, this stuff's great. And the science that they can bring on this at this point, the NIBIN system that they run is like incredible. And with the computer technology and everything, I mean, I'm sure defense attorneys want to say that because it's such good evidence, but they can litigate that all they want. And there will have to be some litigation about it at some point.
Yeah, exactly. So those would be, as you say, two important hearings coming up.
So how long did the hearing last today and how many recesses were there?
There was only one recess, right, Kevin? Unless I blacked out for lunch. And that was about, I think, an hour recess.
And the hearing started at 10 a.m. and I think it ended a little before 3. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that sounds right.
It's a pretty long hearing, actually, for relatively little done.
Yeah, it's really amazing. Did the judge give any indication of when we can expect a ruling? I mean, this is just, what's funny to me is this is just another reason there's no way this is going to happen in January. We just had an all-day hearing on the question of, do we move him from the prison to the jail?
Yeah.
Right? So, yeah.
And that was a surreal moment where Nick McClellan basically got up at the end and was like, listen, we don't really care where he goes. We just wanted to defend the sheriff's office on some of the stuff you're saying. Basically, it felt like it was more of a a pushback to some of the public kind of sniping that's been going on to a certain extent. Like they're saying their side of the story, as opposed to the real substance of the matter, which is like, where should he be? Should he be living before trial?
I wouldn't presume to try to guess or forecast how Judge Gold will rule. I will note, as we mentioned earlier, there was that moment where she said to the defense attorney, it sounds like most of your arguments are about your convenience and not your clients. And then there was also a moment which might be kind of a horror story for attorneys, where she said to him, I noticed that in your brief on this, you cited a bunch of cases. None of those cases were Indiana cases, were they? And he said, no, but some of them were federal cases. And she said, yeah, but none of them are from this circuit, are they?
You don't want to say, you don't want to say these are federal cases when clearly this is state court.
Yeah.
The other thing, and we haven't even talked about this, we talked about how this morphed from a suppression hearing to is he being held in the right place hearing or his mental competency hearing. It's supposed to be a bail hearing. And then, and then it got converted into is there going to be a bail hearing at any point, or if they just sort of waived that argument?
I don't know if they've officially waived anything, but I don't see there being.
I don't see that happening.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I think we're looking at a trial in 2025 at this point. Maybe the end of 2024, maybe summer if we're really lucky. But there is so much they've got to deal with, and that's if this even goes to trial. If he's found competent and all this other stuff comes in, you got to think at that point maybe it's.
The hearing was surprisingly contentious at times.
Yeah.
There were moments, I think I mentioned the warden who was a witness. There were moments where the defense attorney seemed to be trying very hard to get a reaction from the warden.
It got spicy because also I'm a journalist, I'm not an attorney. I've been to these Delphi hearings before and they can be quite dry, frankly. Okay, we're talking about different issues. That's what you expect. And so that's what I expected going into this. So when I'm on the edge of my seat and there's this back and forth, this warden's unflappable. And the defense attorney's hey, did you know that there's an article that your prison sucks? And he's basically no, I never read it. And it's oh my God, what's going on? I'm paraphrasing, but
not by much.
But not by much. We're just sitting here stressing out. What am I seeing? And I don't know. It as you said, the fact that this devolved, I shouldn't say devolved because maybe it was helpful for us all to see this. And frankly, we saw the defense talking points come out with the pictures and stuff. And now we're seeing, a lot of people were kind of the Carroll County Sheriff's Office is corrupt that this happened. And we were always they're gagged. And also that means they can't respond to any allegations right now. They can't just get out there and be we didn't do that. And so this was their chance to have that moment essentially. But yeah, there were so many, it got crazy. At one point the prosecutor, Rosie put his intern on the stand to basically be a fly on the wall of here was our negative experience in the prisons where we're being followed around with cameras and stuff. And McClellan just basically was how old are you? Oh, I'm 20 years old. Okay.
They put their intern on the stand?
Yeah.
Yeah, the defense attorney was an intern.
Poor intern, man.
Great. And honestly, relatable because he talked about leaving his wallet when he was supposed to be going to the prison and they were nice and let him in anyway. I'm that's definitely that would be me. So I thought he did a great job, honestly, but there was brutal moments.
That's an interesting move to put your intern on the
He's getting some testimony experience. He can use that later in life.
He's gonna be a great lawyer someday. And I don't know. But it was there were weird moments like that where you're just what is going on?
I do have a quick question because I think people will be interested. Obviously, phones were not allowed in this courtroom, and I assume it was very well attended. Probably, did you guys have to wait a long time in line? How did you ensure you could get into the courtroom? And this leads to, I'm going to get the question out so you guys can talk about, did the judge address the fact that there was a lot of public interest, or whether future hearings he'd allow, the public in, phones, any sort of, live reporting, that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Judge Gull, who's the judge in this, she's actually based in Allen County, Indiana, which is Fort Wayne, essentially. And she was part of a pilot program where they were Indiana hates camera. We've hated cameras in courts forever. She was actually part of the pilot program where they started to introduce them. So she's kind of at the cutting edge of that movement. And so a lot of people based on that have speculated that she very well may ultimately when it comes to trial, allow some form of cameras in. And the judge has a lot of discretion. So it may be like a pool setting or something like that, but we expect there may be some movement on that. She didn't address it at this time, I don't think. And then as for us, we're
So the hearing started.
We're unhinged, basically.
The hearing started at 10 a.m. and the doors of the court opened at 8 a.m. and we got there at 5:30 a.m.
And we were number one in line.
And it turned out to be crucial because we got it in the front row.
And we felt really stupid, right? Because it was, a lot of people showed up and it filled up quickly because there was so many reserved seating. But we were like, a lot of people showed up at like 7 and they were fine. They got in.
But being in the front row was crucial because the sound system in the courtroom was basically non-existent. And there were times, even in the front row of the public seating, we had to really struggle to hear what was being said. And the people in rows behind us, there were reporters who came to us after the hearing and said, I need to talk to you because I have no idea what just happened.
Yeah, and there was one guy, literally, there was a prison captain who was so soft-spoken. And like, God bless this man. I'm sure this is just how he talks, but he was so soft-spoken. Like, we were in the front row in the central aisle. Like, we had the best, and I could not understand half of what he said. He could have been saying something really like a huge bombshell, and I would have just been like, okay, like, what's this guy saying? Just like writing down question marks, basically.
I mean, can I just say from all of us, because you can tell how many people are here, thank you for getting up at 5:30 to ensure that you were in line. And that's not crazy. I've done that for different types of hearings because you don't know how oversubscribed it's going to be. And you know, there's no kind of corollary to this. So thank you, first of all, for being awake for so long and still talking so late into the night with us.
We love talking with you guys, and it's kind of interesting and fun to unpack with you because you have that expertise where you can answer some of our questions or be like, that's really weird, and maybe confirm some of what we were thinking. I think generally, this is a case that we both come to care deeply about. It's these two girls. They did not get to live the lives they were supposed to lead. And it just left this community and these families. It's just devastating. And so we at this point feel like we have an emotional interest in it and we want to do it justice. And I feel like we do better work when we're able to view the actual hearings and kind of talk about that instead of some of the speculation online, if that makes sense.
Well, is there anything else we missed? Anything else we need to talk about? Anything else?
Maybe just very quickly, I can tell you. So the whole hearing revolved around this issue of whether or not it was appropriate to put Richard Allen in prison instead of in the Carroll County Jail. And the attorney, Brad Rosie, made the argument that if you follow the statute, technically, you'd only be allowed to do this if he faced imminent danger, if he stayed in the Carroll County Jail. And they had the sheriff who wrote the motion at the time, who's now no longer sheriff. They had the current sheriff, and both of them indicated there were no actual threats. It was just their knowledge of conditions at the jail is pretty understaffed. It's small. And based upon their knowledge, they imagined there could be threats or there could be problems. And so a lot of it turned on, can you use this law even if there's no imminent danger?
That's
pretty interesting, actually. Yeah.
And something that we've actually, I haven't studied, the case law surrounding that statute, but we often do see that where we place people because we know certain things, even if we don't know specifically about this defendant. Child molesters, child murderers, generally across the board are going to be treated pretty harshly by their co-prisoners. And I've had hearings about where to place defendants, even if a specific threat isn't against that person, because a warden or some sort of agent can get on the stand and say, this category of people will face danger, and we don't want to get to the point where their life is in danger before we then transfer them. So everything you're saying sounds like appropriate arguments.
Was the family there?
Yes, both families were there. They came in. They have reserved seating, so I think they have some sort of arrangement where they tell the court officials how many people are coming, and they'll kind of put them in a couple of rows. And it's just always a reminder when you're seeing them, or even when you're seeing Richard Allen's family, we're very interested in this, and some of the stuff is kind of interesting, or even you're wow, okay, this is wild. But at the end of the day, it's like this horrible, horrible tragedy. And so we just, I mean, like, that's always a good reminder, hopefully for us. And then for the rest of the media covering this, it's like, stay focused on whatever. I mean, this is a really important case, and they're the reason why.
Well, I think that's a good place to end on. Alice, I do have one thing I want to say. I did go to brunch, and then we went to the pool, and it was a great day. So thank you, Alice, for having us over.
Kevin, Anya, I'm really sorry you had to see that very, very sad display of Brett proving his friendship to me. But before we do sign off for the day, I mean, I do have to say just thank you again to both of you for your public service in getting up, before dawn in order to be there, because you are right. There is absolutely no substitute, especially when cameras and phones are not allowed in the courtroom, to hear this so that you can, as you said, report about this case with integrity. And we so appreciate you spending so much time doing so and sharing your expertise and your experience with all of us. And yeah, well, I just can't say enough about that. And I hope you guys get some sleep tonight. But before we do sign off, is there anything else you guys would like to add?
No, you guys asked brilliant questions, and we just want to say we love the work you guys do, and we're huge fans. So thank you so much for having us on.
Thank you so much. You guys have to listen to The Murder Sheet. They are covering Delphi closely, but they have also lots of other episodes that you guys would absolutely love. And so until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is The Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to The Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I was about to say brought to you by. So see, guys, you will not feel this. I'm happy. I'm going to try again. Sorry.
Nailed it, Alice.
Guys, thank you, guys. I almost said something else, but
Brought to you by.
Oh, well.
No, not at all.
I'm going to go viral on YouTube.
Comes with the territory. Whatever gets clicks, it's okay.
There you go. That's the motto. Well, this was so great. Thank you guys so much. Like, it's always delightful to talk to you guys.